Welcome to the Shooting Times podcast, which is brought to you by Field Sports Press. It's starting to feel a little bit autumnal here. How is it with you, Richard?
Hot as Hades, I'm afraid.
Last week, Richard and I were standing in a field. Just more than a week ago, actually. We were restoring an old flight pond, which we'll maybe talk about in a little bit, which was a lot of fun. And that really felt like the sort of Serengeti there. Things are starting to turn a bit. The issue that we're focusing on this week is the issue that hits the shelves tomorrow, which will be the 13th of September. So do head down to your local shop or do subscribe. At the moment, we've still got our subscription offer on where you get shooting insurance, fully comprehensive shooting insurance with a Shooting Times subscription. It's been a really interesting week in the news this week. We've had everything from ducks to things on GL43, all sorts of things. But first, I think Richard Negus, most of you will know Richard Negus, who reads Shooting Times. Lots of people know of Richard Negus who don't read Shooting Times. You are a hedgelayer, a writer, a hedge mapper. That seems to be taking up a lot of your time at the moment. Tell me about mapping hedges.
Well, it's something that I've almost made a rod for my own back, really. I suggested to the powers that be at DEFRA that there was no point us having all these swanky plans to go and plant millions of miles of more hedging or pay us money to go and manage hedges better for wildlife if we didn't actually know what was there and how much and the condition that it was in. So essentially I charge around the East Anglian countryside with my business partner Richard Gould in a truck, and we map and plot the condition, length, height, width and management prescriptions for the hedges on farms, so that the farmers then get an idea about what they're going to have to do going forward to go and manage their hedges more efficiently and better for wildlife.
In a word, what sort of nick are the hedges of East Anglia in?
Mixed bag. Sorry, that's 2 words.
It's very interesting. Presumably there were many more hedges or many more miles of hedge in East Anglia than there are now at one point. How has that changed over the past?
Well, yes and no.
years?
I mean, but before the Enclosures Act, there would have been far fewer. If you look at the work of John Constable, you see vast acreage of open land, scrubby corners, trees. Then enclosures came in, lots of hedges, and then Second World War, dig for victory. We needed to feed ourselves after the war. The hedges all came out. And then in the late 1990s, they started putting them all back in. I mean, quite literally, sometimes in the same places where they had been grubbed out, 40 years before. But I mean, I don't think it's necessarily the quantity of hedges that is lacking. It's probably been the love and adoration, because when those hedges originally planted, ours was a mixed farming landscape. Now it's overwhelmingly arable. So therefore, why do you need a hedge? And so we have to make a business case for the hedge. And that, I think, is probably what our mapping of hedgerows really does, is we show a farmer it's worth keeping it, and we can make an ecological case, but also a business case for them.
Yeah. Interesting. And when you're not bothering hedges, you are out shooting ducks a lot, playing a little bit of cricket, but ducks and geese, that's one of your big interests. And it probably won't have escaped your attention that your Irish duck shooting colleagues can no longer shoot the same number of species as duck as they could do in seasons past. So 4 duck species have come off the quarry list there. The pochard, goldeneye, pintail, and I'm never quite sure, I must admit, how you pronounce the greater scaup. Is that it?
Scorp, yeah.
Scorp, you would say.
I call them a scorp.
Is that the Irish pronunciation or the...
That's the Suffolk pronunciation, which therefore is right.
Have you ever shot one of them?
No.
No.
In fact, the only one out of those 4 I've ever shot is a pintail. Not for want of trying necessarily, but it's an interesting thing, and it's something that's going to arrive here.
Well, it's sort of already here, actually. I think the government have said that, they are reviewing quarry lists, and BASC are sort of fighting that. But it's an interesting one, because actually not only, I think it'd be quite easy to say, oh, well, look, most people can go without shooting the common goldeneye, right? That's no kind of But at the same time, the devil is in the details. So Birdwatch Ireland also called for further analysis to be undertaken in relation to the tufted duck, jacksnipe, which of course we don't shoot here, but woodcock, teal, widgeon, grouse, and mallard, and common snipe, which is,
it's an interesting thing because they are basing this, I presume, upon their own records. And probably I don't know if they do in Ireland, but here in the UK, we use the bag returns are used as a means of assessing the health and numbers of a particular species. Now, bag returns can be a useful tool, but they can also be a double-edged sword. So therefore, if, for example, we had, like we did last season, a huge amount of pink-footed geese, and a lot of widgeon come in, therefore QED, will get shot. A cynic, or possibly someone who was against shooting, would quite easily go and say, well, they're clearly shooting too many because they might be basing on a year. We're dealing with migratory species, and they have good years and bad years for a number of reasons. So one of the things that I've tried to, I've asked the chairman of the Wildfowling Club, of which I'm a member of, is that we need to have a number of bird counters within our own body, and that they should get trained by the BTO so that we can see if these numbers tally up. Because I've watched how the bird counts go on some of the bits of foreshore and on the tidal rivers here, and the times of which they're counting and the means of which they're counting, and having been involved with grey partridge counts and farmland birdland surveys, I know that you can pitch up on the day that you have said, and there won't be a bird in the sky. And it's always that case of, well, you should have seen it yesterday. And so I think that constant assessment by we as wildfowlers, we always have on our clubs now, the Great Yarmouth Wildfowling and Conservation Association. Well, perhaps the onus is on us. If we want to shoot ducks and geese in the wild, perhaps we should justify our position by doing some counting of our own. And then that way we can actually hold to the feet of some of these people who are making simplistic arguments, is that, well, you should stop shooting them. And
there's also just, a really interesting point that, grouse, of course, there aren't many grouse in Ireland. We've had people writing in Shooting Times about that. But where there are grouse, I believe that the grouse are there often because people did shoot them, and, people who want to shoot them are conserving them. So it's that thing. And there's a really interesting point that, capercaillie, there's very few capercaillie left in Scotland, but there are people who will tell you quite interestingly that they think if you could shoot a few capercaillie cocks from time to time, it would have meant that you had people who were trying to conserve them more actively, because that was the sort of, that's the carrot. So it's a really, really interesting thing. And I think once these species are gone off quarry lists, they're not going to come back on. It's a sad thing. And particularly, they have a very different culture around shooting in Ireland to the culture we have here. And it's a very sort of rough shooting culture. In some ways, it's a culture that I think is probably a better culture, although there'll be people who'll be upset to hear that. But I think that is true. Moving on, GL43, which sounds very complicated and boring, and sort of is quite complicated and boring, except actually it affects a lot of people. So lawyers acting on behalf of BASC have filed a claim for a judicial review of DEFRA's decision to change the licensing regime for the release of gamebirds in certain places. What that means in real terms, Richard, if I'm getting this right, is that where you have areas of kind of conservation concern, you can no longer put birds down there. So places like Salisbury Plain, is that right? And maybe even other places around you that have been affected?
Yeah, around near us, there are, I know of a couple of shoots along in the coastal district, in the Sandlings, who have encountered this very issue. I think it slightly came out of left field, as far as I can tell. And it's something that's still befuddling me, and I'm glad actually that they've got some lawyers on the case from BASC, because I think this is probably a bit like DEFRA's we're going to plant 466 million more hedge whips. They just clutched a figure from out of the air and thought, that sounds quite good, because that 500 meters from, I mean, it is quite slightly crazy when you think about one of the reasons why these are particularly areas of scientific interest and high nature density is largely because they were improved and continue to be maintained by people who shoot. So therefore, it almost seems counterintuitive to go and say, well, we're going to stop the very driver.
We're going to take the carrot away.
Yeah, exactly. Which I'm afraid is much the same as going back to the ducks, is the fact that we haven't, if I'd be perfectly frank, made a good enough case within the shooting community that we are first and foremost conservationists. Now, I know there are lots within the shooting, well, there are certainly some people I can name within the shooting community who aren't actually first. And
that's why we got you on. We just want you to give us a rundown of the people who you
those individuals. Right, I've got a list here, and
But it is true. And I mean, look, it comes back to, why did we restore that flight pond last week? Well, because I want to make a pond, which will be wonderful for lots of things, but I want to shoot a few duck off it a year. And that's, and I've done it before and I'll do it again. And, if they said to me, actually, you know what, you can't shoot ducks anymore, would I have done it? Maybe I would have done. I like to think I would have done, but I probably would have been a bit slower to get round to it. And that's, that's the truth.
Yeah. I think that the grey partridge is a classic case in point. I mean, the grey partridge here in East Anglia, particularly in my bit of Suffolk, if I think of a good friend of mine, Adam Steed, who won the GWCT Grey Partridge Award a few years ago, he's actually a school teacher by profession, and how he fits in his keepering roles in, I have no idea. He's remarkable. But his passion for that bird is the thing that gets him up and out on his predator control. And he changed the mindset. His father is the farm manager on this particular farm, and his passion for the grey partridge managed to bring around almost an about turn in one of the most commercial, production obsessed farms into now being a place where we did the hedgerow management plan on it. You can really see the fruits of his labours, and because we're working on a farm cluster level, you see it spill out further. So I think people like Adam Steed are champions, and perhaps we need to do a little bit of introspective soul searching and say, are we going to be an Adam Steed, or are we actually?
Well, let's get on to grey. So we're going to go there. We're going to go to grey partridges in a bit. Just with GL43. I mean, the thing is, you were saying left field. I heard from two pretty senior politicians that the thing came as a complete surprise to them. And they then said to me, but don't worry about it, because we've got this one under control. They said there are a lot of friends of shooting in Parliament. We've got this one under control. It doesn't seem as though they did. And that's it's extraordinary to live in a country where, things just happen. You wake up one day and sort of, something that you did a lot of, and that lots of people do a lot of, and that is quite an important part of rural communities, is no longer happening because somebody made a mistake. And we'll wait to see. But, this mistake, if it was a mistake, has been cheered by lots of people, but it doesn't seem to have come from a place of kind of thought or of sort of scientific enlightenment or whatever. Just lastly on news, a very interesting story that there's due to be a breakthrough Pfizer Lyme disease vaccine, which has now been delayed until 2026. And I was just thinking, lots of people who you work with, I'm sure, have Lyme disease. It's a sort of consequence of spending a life working in the field. And it would be a really big thing, actually, I think there's an interesting thing that people involved in field sports, gamekeepers and so on, they do tend to kind of suffer in silence. But if you meet people with Lyme disease, it's really not a fun thing to have at all.
No, my business partner Richard, he has Lyme's disease, and it's akin to my father, who contracted malaria when he was fighting the communists out in Malaya in 1949, and he gets these recurring bouts. Richard gets the same, and it really lays him low. It seems to knock his immune system out of alignment, and for a great big lump like him, he's really quite laid low with it. Makes him feel like he's got a sort of a bad dose of the flu, I suppose, with a sort of added dash of the sweats and feeling maudlin.
Just a terrible hangover.
Yeah, I mean, basically that sort of circumstance, of course, I wouldn't know what one felt like. But yeah, it's. I mean, I note that the original vaccine which they had for it and then took off the market said that it was thought that it caused arthritis. Well, I haven't got Lyme's disease, but I've certainly got arthritis because I work with my hands for a living. And I wonder just how many of those people who've got Lyme's disease are people who are working out in the countryside, farmers, keepers, stalkers, etc. Well, they're all pretty much going to have arthritis because they spend most of their time stuck in a ditch. So is it actually that the scientists once again have leapt to the simplistic conclusion that the Lyme's disease jab did it, and it wasn't actually the fact that they're jabbing all these people with Lyme's disease who have got arthritis because they're kneeling in ditches? Although I am told that Justin Bieber's has got Lyme disease.
Very keen on his hedge laying.
You were going to say, I've offered him a billhook many a time, but he's always shunned my offer.
To lay his hedges in. There was a very interesting piece this week on spaniels that I just wanted to touch on briefly. So there was quite a lot. I mean, I didn't actually know this, but it makes perfect sense. Do you know why spaniels are called spaniels in theory?
No, as an owner of two, I don't know why.
In theory, because they come from Spain.
Oh.
Which they don't look very Spanish to me. They don't seem very Spanish to me. But that's very interesting. And also just that puppies over 25 pounds would be springers, and then smaller. So there wasn't this split at all. And I just think there's an interesting point there in sort of, I don't know if you've ever been to Crufts, but you know, sort of dog breeding is a very interesting thing. And I think in some ways the field sports community do dogs kind of great favours in breeding dogs that are fit for purpose and that are healthy, rather than breeding dogs just to look like, you know, whatever the kind of latest fad is, you know, whether it's the Bully XL that we're all reading so much about.
The spaniel is, or has been for quite a long while, one of the few dogs that the show breeders hadn't got their greasy mitts on and turned into a monumental freak. And then you now see the things that masquerade as cocker spaniels, or the wheezing lumps that are the clumber. They're not fit for purpose, most of the show-bred dogs. And with cockers that I have, there are two diverging breeds, more or less. There's the show bench cocker that has cocker rage, which sounds very exciting.
Have you ever actually seen a cocker in a rage?
No, Mabel sulked the other day because I went out for an evening flight and I didn't take her with me because I thought it was a bit too hot. And I wouldn't say rage, it was more of a sort of disgruntlement. So I've seen cocker disgruntlement, but no pure rage. But I'm led to believe it only happens in the show bench things. And the spaniel is a fascinating thing. And, you know, I suppose one of the issues with our kennel club registration and the gene pooling thereof is that I'd be quite content that, I mean, I've bred a litter out of Mabel and I've kept Blythe, one of her daughters, back. And one of the purposes I bred with that was an excellent cocker dog I went to, and it's improved the coat. The pup's coat is far better than Mabel's coat. Is she going to be a better worker? That remains to be seen. She's only 18 months old.
There's so much randomness in it.
I mean, is Mabel actually a one-off? Did I put more effort into her? I don't know. But I think that the opportunity to actually add a dash of Springer is in a working spaniel, to me, seems a very sensible option, because you're making horses for courses. But the moment you go from it being a cocker, which is a kennel club registered thing, and I can go and sell those puppies for, you know, 1,400 quid. It's now a sprocker. Oh, it's a mongrel. So therefore it's now less. But that doesn't seem to go on to the pet dog world, where if I went and put a poodle over Mabel, I'd be able to sell her progeny for about £5,000 to ladies from Essex and accuse it of being a hypoallergenic companion dog.
Yeah. That's very interesting. There's a piece I really enjoy that we run from time to time called 100 Years of Keepering. So Lindsay Waddell does it, and then Dave Whitby also, who's a very, very good writer, actually very passionate guy, and very much calls a spade a spade. What I like about Lindsay and what I like about Dave is that they've been doing it for so long. They just kind of, they say it as it is. They're very happy to do so. So Lindsay wrote a piece about how much shoot days have changed in his lifetime, and he was saying that there are so many things that we sort of think, or that some people think, are kind of traditional now. So like eating 11sies, like little Ponzi Scotch eggs, and kind of odd glasses of gin concoctions, which he says actually are very new and are sort of born out of kind of the commercialization of shooting. And that in the past, lying on some straw in a barn and having a pretty rough and ready sandwich was kind of like the order of the day, and that you tended to have fewer beaters, fewer people picking up. But I think what I was thinking when I was reading this is, how will shoot days change from here? Because they do change, and the countryside has always changed. Sort of where we are now. But what do you think, Richard? In 25 years, 30 years time, what will a shoot day look like?
Well, hopefully, that sort of grand luncheons and whatnot will continue, but it will continue on simulated clay days. Because if you want to have all that stuff, dancing girls and fine wines and what have you, then fine. You can do that in the clinical world of a simulated clay day. But I think one of the biggest gripes I have about shooting, and I can say this as a hedge layer and a curmudgeonly wildfowler, is the commercialisation of shooting is actually the thing that will kill shooting. It's not going to be Chris or Mark.
And do you mean because of optics, or because of the ecological impact, or because of all of that, or
all together? I think a very good keeper in Suffolk called Rod Hazel said to me that people are making money out of something that was never designed to be profitable. And
what does he do? He's a keeper?
He's a keeper.
And should be a coppicer, really, with a name like that.
Yes, Rod Hazel. Yeah, I know. Is a double whammy of coppicing excellence, isn't it? And Rod said this from the heart, because I think when I read Lindsay's piece, I thought, God, Rod has basically said exactly the same thing to me. Is this is we're involved in field sports. And the Americans get it right that this is hunting. They may gorge and dine and enjoy the fruits of their labours afterwards by eating what you have shot. But the purpose of shooting is hunting. It is not to go and have 5 attractive ladies in tweed miniskirts deliver you a runny yolked Scotch egg at 11 o'clock. It's taking the whole purpose of the sport out of it. Now, you may want that luxury, but you don't do it within the framework of what is essentially.
And what do you say to people involved in that world who would say, but but we're providing employment for those 5 ladies?
No, yes. Let's think, when shooting was in a place whereby the RSPB had no problem with us, that Mark Avery waxes lyrical about the darling days of Dick Potts. There weren't any runny Scotch eggs and silly 11s around then. I think that we have become too softened, and we've forgotten what sport is. You had a debate the other day about what is sport. Sport is, there is an element of the sporting about it. And
there's a really interesting thing in this issue. I noted that the theme that runs through this issue is people suffering for their sport. So like Jamie Tusting, hill log fishing, and going and trying to catch mackerel, and he loses all of his lures in the kelp or whatever, and then we've got a new writer who's shooting warped up grouse and sort of sweating profusely under the hot sun and what what I mean. And that's kind of and then we've got Felix Pettit, our new staff writer, who drives 15 hours north to the Isle of Harris to hunt 2 grouse. And there's something that to me is sport, and we've kind of, as I think, as you were about to say, when it gets too easy, I think you lose something that fundamentally makes it special.
Yes, I mean, but it's simulated in day-to-day life. I mean, it used to be that we went, woo, it's strawberry season, or it's now the various seasonal produce used to be the thing that you had possibly sometimes even a glut of, and you delighted in those things and you bottled and pickled them to try and save them to have a little flavoursome of it. So supermarkets now will sell you strawberries 12 months of the year. You can have it all right now. And I think I mean, it's not me being a curmudgeon, it's actually being a pragmatist, is that you can't just have all the pheasants right now. You can't have it easy. I can't remember whether I read it in the Shooting Times or I heard it on a documentary that some chap had taken over a shoot and he was hugely proud of the fact that his guns would be able to walk to their peg in their loafers if they so wished, because there would be no mud to walk on because he had manicured the lawns to these pegs so perfectly. And I thought, I'd quite like to take you out into the marsh and not just drown you, but actually show you what sport is all about. You know, I used to sell hunters for a living, and I used to sell them for a lot of money to some people.
Horses rather than Wellington boots. Yeah.
The Wellington boots. Yes, I don't wear hunters; they're awful things. But those horses that I sold, I think hunting in its way was slightly more pure, because as soon as hounds went away, yes, you could go and buy a very expensive horse from me, and it might jump that hedge for you. But if you weren't proficient enough to stay on its back, then you would still end up on the deck. Hunting in a way was quite pure. And we have made shooting, not completely, but when I read Lindsay's article, the things that he was brewing the loss of, and he was equating it to what he knows is the uplands, I see it down here. Now, I'll be honest, I suppose it is, as Tim Bonner from the Countryside Alliance likes to say, is it's all wonderful because it's democratized shooting, you know, commercial shooting. Yeah. But what price democracy? You know, it is that we're in the situation now where governments are trying to tell us where we can release pheasants, because clearly there have been too many birds put down in places. And we do know that occasionally people do put far too many birds down, and it has a biodiversity net disastrous effect.
Do you think landowners have, I mean, you know, I said this actually when I was at a book festival and somebody got very upset and walked out. But do you think landowners have more of a responsibility when it comes to shooting to make sure that shooting on their land is done right, and not just to say, oh, well, you know, the keeper looks after that or the shoot tenant looks after that? You know, whose responsibility is it?
Well, I suppose the buck must stop eventually with the landowner, because it has to stop somewhere. Or otherwise we will get legislation foisted upon us. So Tim Furbank from Oakbank is very eloquent about how we self-regulate. And I think the buffers have come off self-regulation. And quite frequently what happens is you'll get people tutting about excesses, but then you'll discover that they've actually been shooting on that excessive place themselves the week before. So I suppose we go back to the salmon fishing analogy, is that you'll pay a lot of money to go on a very good beat of a salmon river because there is a stronger chance that you may catch a fish. Whereas what we have now done is we've hedged our bets to such a degree that we can guarantee, what's your bag going to be? It's going to be this. I can guarantee it's going to be that. And I think the runny egg, Scotch egg is actually the metaphor I'd use for it. Less Scotch eggs, more mud on your knees, and man up a bit. Even if you're a woman, you can woman up.
Yeah. So do you believe that self-regulation fundamentally is possible? You know, do you believe we can, because I mean, I like to think, yes, it is perhaps, but actually, you know, do you think in 25 years, 30 years time, people will turn around and go, right, we finally got that right, that self-regulation? Or do you think we're going to have regulation imposed upon us, or simply that we will have regulation imposed upon us? And what do you predict?
I think we can self-regulate, but we've got to do it pretty damn quick. And I also think that what we've got to probably do is not do what we did with hunting. We lost hunting, and I had to lay off 5 members of staff because we trusted one organisation to protect us, and they'll be fine. Don't worry, we've got the ear of the politicians. As GL43 shows, we don't actually have the ear of the politicians who count. So therefore, we have to show that we are biodiversity net contributors.
Yeah.
And much like we're saying with ducks, is that if we can go and show that the impact we have on ducks is at best nothing, or at best we're creating more, then we can say we're a good organization. We know that we are a community. We're not an industry. We're a community, and communities can self-regulate. If we want to be an industry, which a lot of people keep calling us the shooting industry, well then, the government probably should regulate us, because if we want all the trappings of industry, then we're going to have to take all the negatives that comes with industry.
My last, I think the last topic I'd just like to touch on briefly, you wrote a very nice piece about counting grey partridges with your son. Where were you, and how have the grey partridge numbers changed there over the years?
It's a fascinating place, Flea Barn, and it's an example of what I see happening in mid-Suffolk, an area that I know extremely well. And they are one of the barometer species. They are one of the birds that farmers have started to embrace, because they recognize and they see them. They've almost become a bit of a totem that they're doing things right. And they're following the mantra of the way that farming is going. And if you go and tell a farmer, we've seen a nice brood of 7, they're actually going, well, that's good. And the only other birds that I see in Suffolk that are like that, they get equally as passionate about turtle doves and yellowhammers. They're the 3. They're almost like the Suffolk wild trinity. We've got the holy trinity that is the red poll, the Suffolk sheep, and the Suffolk punch horse. And we've got the holy trinity of turtle dove, grey partridge, and yellowhammer on the farms as the wild species.
It's an interesting thing, isn't it, that only one of those gets shot?
Yeah,
and the future for the one that gets shot is probably brighter than the future for the other 2. I mean, the turtle dove particularly.
Well, it's the knock-on effect, I guess, is that turtle doves obviously get shot.
Well, I was going to say they do get
over the pond, and we can't do a lot about that. But I think one of the things is the fact that if you actually look at it, I mean, the numbers of brown hares we have are phenomenal. The numbers of linnets that we have, the numbers of red polls we have, a lot of the farming practices which work so well for the grey partridge have knock-on effects for so many others that we see around us. I mean, some of the wildflower margins that have now got thistles in, the numbers of goldfinch I'm seeing around now are phenomenal compared to what they used to be. And they are largely all thanks to the grey partridge and its iconic status within this bunch of farmers we have here. And one of the interesting things I see is we have a huge amount of shooting around here, of which there are either syndicates, farmers' shoots, or small commercial affairs that might have 1 or 2 days to make sure it washes its face. And they're putting in proper, what I would call conservation efforts. They're not putting just a lump of maize in, so that whole birds. They're looking at this holistically, and Flea Barn is one of those places. And it just happens to be because Ed Nesling, who owns the place, he's now farming wildlife the same way as he farms his crops, with that diligent attention to detail. And his harvest is when we do a bird count, or otherwise he'll send me a thing on his phone saying, look at this lot, and it's a load of linnets, or it's the grey partridges. And the map that I've got plotted is showing good signs. There are factors which have worked this year with weather, largely, but then you get the negative factors is that there are more and more buzzards and more kites and more sparrowhawks that are predating. So that cover and my hedges are so important because they're the place where they can hide. So it's all a holistic thing.
You're coming to the end of working on a book. We won't give too much away, but that's in the pipeline? Yes, it is. It's about, funnily enough, hedges. I'm a rather one-dimensional individual. But it's all about hedges, but it's about their place in our farm landscape, and it's almost, if you like, the antithesis to the rewilding mantra. We put hedges in. There is no such thing as a natural hedge. Every single one of those hedges was planted by man, and it's up to us to manage them so that they act best for us as consumers of food, and they also acts best for wildlife. And so therefore the hedge is a metaphor for how we manage the countryside then and how we manage the countryside now is pretty clear.
And it just happens to be that this quirky job that I've got is now all of a sudden quite sexy.
And when can we expect to? When's that due to land on the shelves?
You'll have to ask our mutual friend.
Yeah, good. Well, no,
I'm not entirely sure.
It's exciting.
I think it's spring 25.
Yeah, good. With a major publisher, one of the biggest. Which is exciting. Brilliant. Well, thank you very much, Richard, for coming on, and we'll certainly get you back on when that book lands. And in the meantime, do head down to your local shop and buy your copy of Shooting Times, or do subscribe and save yourself a journey. Thank you.